My name is Shiraz Sethi. I'm the Managing Partner for DWF Middle East. I would like to introduce James Fox, who is the head of our disputes for the Middle East, who will be moderating today's session. So over to you, James, who will then introduce to you the panel. Thank you very much.
Good morning, everyone. I'm just going to briefly introduce the panel. I'll ask each of them to say something about each other. So on my right is Amira Ali, who's the Middle East head of banking and finance at DWF.
Yep. So I recently joined DWF. I've been in the region for 10 years. In terms of this panel, I was involved in the AHAB restructuring before it went into litigation. I did the Al Ittifaq's deal restructuring, and I was on a secondment at a bank where we looked at just during the time of financial crisis and after it. So we did a lot of restructuring, including in the region and in the US and UK. So this is something that I know pretty well around the region.
Thank you. And then first on my left, who has described herself as a rose between two thorns, is Gail Goring, who's Director of Regulatory and Compliance at Rethink Me.
Hi, everybody. I'm, as you can hear, Jamaican, but was in the Cayman Islands for 15 years. Worked with the regulator there and the Attorney General's department. So started the beginning of the SARD episodes, but didn't manage to stay through to the rest. And as the ex-regulator for Cayman, was seconded over to do some work with ADGM, and then it just morphed from there, and I haven't left since 2016, except for Christmas. It's a journey from legal to regulatory and compliance, and so that's what my focus.
Thank you. And last but not least, we have Neil Hayward, who is the Managing Director of Alvarez & Marsal Middle East.
Hi, so yeah, I'm Neil Hayward. I'm co-head of the Alvarez & Marsal team in the region. In the region, we focus on performance improvement, turnaround, restructuring, and we never normally mention it, but also insolvency or bankruptcy. I've been in the region for the last 8 years. Started off with this comment to the government of Dubai, advising them on Dubai World, Nakheel, Dry Docks World. And then, since then, from an advisory side, I've been involved in most of the major restructurings in the region. My previous background was based in the UK, Europe, and also the States. So in terms of some of these cases we're talking about, I've still got pretty good insights into both the legislation in each of those areas, but also how it's applied practically, which tends to be what's important to sort of most people. How do you take the legal element and then apply it in practice? Particularly in the region, that tends to be sort of the key differentiator as to how you get your money back.
Excellent. As many of you will know, it's been a busy week before the courts in the Cayman. The first news of the month, at the very beginning, was that 10 years after the financial crisis, judgment has just finally been handed down in the Al Ghassabi case. The $126 billion fraud was described in the judgment as one of the largest Ponzi schemes in history. Now, Amira, can you give us some background to the case, what the judgment means and its effect on creditors?
Yep. So it's been 10 years since Al Ghassabi started, and I think people kind of forget how it all went down. I remember it pretty clearly because I was in the office when it happened, and there was a call saying, you guys need to turn up. But that's how it started for me. But for everybody, factually, there was a default by Al Ghassabi about $9 billion. And at the same time, there was a default by Al Sanai Group of about between $7 to $8 billion. And there was at the time, it was kind of like, okay, the financial crisis has happened, and everybody kind of blamed it, what was happening in the world, as opposed to what was happening on the ground. What transpired after that was Al Ghassabi had two institutions. One was TIBC, which was a bank in Bahrain and Money Exchange, and which were managed by Man Al Sana, and it was claimed by Al Ghassabi that there was a fraud committed in there and there was money borrowed, and which the company did not know about, which was guaranteed by letter of credits in relation to exporters that did not exist, and that is how it all went down. Al Ghassabi, over the years, the Al Ghassabi family has claimed that they did not know about any of the monies that were borrowed. by Mal Al-Sana, which were used by him to essentially for his own businesses, which included 6 companies in Cayman Island, which were used to fund various businesses. Creditors at the time were pretty open, and the steering committees were set up for both of them, but then started the litigation process, and Ahab filed the first case for litigation against Al-Sana on basis of forgery and fraud. And that is when a lot of restructuring kind of came to halt, because everybody wanted to be the first in line to get the money, and a lot of creditors filed. And a lot of judgments came out on both sides. Fast forward these many years, what's happened is the only thing Ahab has been able to win against Al-Sana is a personal claim that was given by Cayman courts of $2.5 billion that he's supposed to pay. The last judgment is a very interesting one, because in that there was a claim of, I think it's $5.1 billion, no, so 4-point-something billion dollars by Al-Ghusaybi against the Al-Sanai group, and the counterclaim of $5.9 billion by Man Al-Sana against Ahab. And the claim, and then there are trustees of Al-Sanai group who are represented. The issue at hand is who gets the money so the creditors can get paid, and which group's creditors get paid. From the judgment, the court held, and I think, and these are the key findings, it's a 1,500-page judgment, and I'm not going to aim to summarize it. But the key points are the claim and the counterclaim were both dismissed. So, but the $2.5 billion claim against Al-Ghusaybi, personally against Mal Al-Sanai, stays. Everybody was very happy, at least on Al-Sanai trustee side, because they thought, hey, we can finally get this money that can be paid. But unfortunately, that's not going to happen, because what's going to happen is Al-Ghusaybi has said there's a direct right to appeal in Cayman, and they're going to file an appeal. So that money is just going to stay in until the entire process is gone. So the creditors, unfortunately, are still going to be left with nothing, or at least left with nothing for a very, very long time. And that brings me to what's been happening on the ground between the creditors and each of the companies. So Al-Ghusaybi has been lucky, because they have been able to, I think last month, reach a settlement with 70% of their creditors, which represents 50% of their debt. So what that means is, under the new bankruptcy law in Saudi Arabia, they can now actually force the other creditors to sign up to the deal. And they have said, at least in the public statements, that they're going to use the real estate asset and the financial assets that they have to pay off their creditors. But as I was talking to somebody earlier, if you look at the secondary market, the exchange of what the secondary debt was trading last week is a lot lower than what's happening now. Al-Mana has unfortunately not been that lucky with its creditors, and some of their assets were liquidated, I think, last month in Dubai, because they haven't been able to reach a settlement with their creditors. And I think, and that is the story, because a lot of these creditors who are even part of the steering committee now actually have real judgments, which they're trying to enforce. I think with Man Al-Sana, there are 42 creditors who have judgments which say that they can be enforced, but they haven't been able to, because the companies are actually not doing any business to actually be able to repay, and all they're looking at is existential assets. I think that kind of, I know it's a long-winded way to answer your question, but it kind of lays down what's happening in that case.
Thank you. And then a matter of days after the judgment, we heard the news, obviously, that the Kuwait Public Institution for Social Security has filed a petition to liquidate Abraj's assets over its alleged inability to repay a $100 million loan. Now, Neil, are you able to give us some background on the case and the situation as it currently stands?
Yeah, I'm very happy to. I guess in contrast to the Al-Ghusaybi one, this one looks like it's going to be resolved one way or the other a little bit more quickly than 10 years. And hopefully we're talking less than a year rather than a matter of years. So I guess what's the timeline to this? So the first that most people knew about there being an issue was probably sort of October, November last year, when there were some relatively public, I wouldn't say announcements, but news articles about some issues at Abraj on its healthcare fund, where 4 of the LPs were investigating a misuse of funds from the healthcare fund called Evercare. And what was really interesting about it was these weren't just sort of nondescript LPs. This was IFC, so part of the World Bank, and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, amongst others. So some pretty high-profile LPs, but also that normally wouldn't allow this to become into the public market. They, normally these sort of things are dealt with behind closed doors unless there's a real issue. And I think that's the first thing that sort of people started being aware of there being a problem. Shortly after that, you had sort of Abraj announcing that it was going to engage KPMG to do a review of the transactions. You started to have executives departing Abraj. There's been a steady stream since then. You also had sort of Abraj trying to mitigate and sort of almost doing the right things from a technical perspective, if you're talking from a restructuring. So you remove the person that's deemed to have been in control in these sides and replace them with alternative managers. But I think there's a consistent theme here where, in my view, they've almost done everything by the book, but not well enough to ever give people the trust that something's actually happening to stabilize the business. So Arif Naqvi removed himself from some of the committees, but he was still head of the firm. And people still believed that he was the one calling the shots. They engaged KPMG to do a review of the specific transactions, but it was such a limited review, and it was being done by the auditor who should have been seeing these transactions going on anyway, that it didn't give anyone the confidence that something was really changing. Because they didn't deal with it well enough, and then you've got executives continuing to leave, so the snowball has just built up over a period of time. You then had Houlihan's being engaged to advise the company. Houlihan's one of the most aggressive investment banks from a restructuring perspective. So again, it's like there's a different market context comes into it. Deloitte are then engaged to do a more comprehensive review. So they've worked out that the KPMG one sticking plaster didn't work. And as you've gone through, so the news has got sort of worse and worse. There's been news articles about other funds being used or the monies in other funds being used for alternative purposes. I think this week there's been the announcement that there was a meeting with the secured creditors yesterday, that Alex Partners are being lined up to take an interim management role at the Evercare Fund. And this snowball of events has now got to the stage where, as you say, the Kuwait Pension Fund has now submitted a claim into the Cayman courts to file for a liquidation of the business. I guess what's interesting about that is this is an unsecured creditor who's taking the action. So generally unsecured creditors in a place where there's lots of secured creditors, taking that action is not going to get you paid back. The only way it would be if you were a really small amount and you were using that leverage that you were small and annoying to get paid off. 100 million, I think, is the amount that people are saying that they are owed. That's not a small amount in the scheme of things. So it's a really interesting dynamic, and it's really forced everyone to accelerate what they're trying to do. And it may mean they do get paid out, or at least get paid out some of it. So from an individual creditor perspective, that may work. But what it does, it makes it worse for everybody else, potentially, because there's less money in the pot for everybody else to be able to stabilize the business and get repaid. I guess, what's my view on what should happen in this? This is, Abraj is a private equity fund, and the company we're dealing with is the holding company of it. So underneath, you've got lots of investment funds which have lots of assets in. And none of those are impacted by this, except for two things. One is the Abraj contagion effect, which means that people within those businesses will leave because they're associated with Abraj. That some of the investment managers may leave as well, and then therefore you don't have a continuity for the business. But also, if you then try and sell the business, there'll be a discount applied, both because of the situation Abraj is in, but also because it's Abraj. So that's the way that some of those assets are going to be impacted. So what does that mean if you're a creditor or a stakeholder in this? You need to get stability. Most of all, on top of stability, you need to get a change in the name, and you need to get a change in the management team, because no one's going to have confidence in anyone that's worked there. There's too much innuendo, because no one's actually come out with a plan or a document to say, this is what happened, these were the issues. It's definitely only limited to this. Everyone is tainted. So my personal view, that for any stakeholder in this, it's how do we stabilize it? We stabilize it by replacing management, and replacing the name, so selling it. The challenge in all these situations is how do you get that to happen when you've had such a powerful chief in sort of Arif Naqvi who's never going to let go. If you look at all the restructurings that haven't worked in the region, Al Jaber probably being the biggest one, they're sort of, they're dominated by a shareholder, a family that is so used to having so much power over a business, they can't pass it over. Even if they probably know in their heart of hearts it's the best thing for them as an individual or a family and will actually create more value for them in the longer term. It's their identity, it's everything to them, it's their family, it's their respect, and they're not going to let that go, even though they probably should. I think that'll be the key challenge at the moment in the sort of weeks of negotiations going on, is how do all the stakeholders get to a position where they can get that transition of power? And annoyingly for them, it may mean that you have to almost let Arif Naqvi go in order to cement some value. Because if I was him, and I've been in that position, the only way I would go is if I'm allowed to go with my head held high. So i.e., there's no problem, nothing to see here. I've stepped down for the sake of the assets. I'm going to be bought out at a reasonable price, and we all move on, and there's no investigation. And as a sort of a creditor or a stakeholder in this, that would be a really bitter pill to swallow. But it's probably the only way to get quick certainty.